My name is Peter Graham. I am the Associate Dean for Arts and Humanities in the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. On behalf of the Chancellor, the Regents, the student staff, alumni, faculty, and my boss, Dean Millie Pena of the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences, welcome to this Living the Promise Symposium. In October, UCR launched this campaign. The goal of the campaign, as many of you know, is to raise $300 million by 2020 to support the students, the faculty, to support research, to support infrastructure here at the University of California, Riverside. One thing I want to say about the campus that makes me very proud, one of the great accomplishments, is that though the campaign is about living the promise and achieving future goals, we're building on some truly remarkable goals. About 15 years ago, 20 years ago, the campus was much smaller, and it did not look like the campus it is today. It did not look like it in terms of size. That's certainly true. There are more students and there are more buildings. But it is a fundamentally different kind of place because of visionary leadership by a chancellor. So Ray Orbach was the chancellor at that time. He was a scientist. I have his autograph. That is, he signed my diploma when I was an undergraduate. He was the provost at UCLA. And he came here and he said he was going to change things. He was going to change things for the better. And he's the one who made this campus the diverse campus it is today by going to every single campus within a 200-mile radius and recruiting, letting students know this was a home for them. And they applied. They came, and over time, they have succeeded to remarkable heights. When you think about a university campus, there's diversity in the student body no matter where you go. And it's a challenge for every single campus because many students, especially underrepresented students, do not succeed, do not graduate at the same levels as the majority students. This is the one campus in the country where that is not true. By creating such a diverse campus, it's proof to the country, it's proof to skeptics that as the world becomes more diverse, it can become a much better place. I'm very proud to be a part of that, a part of the University of California, Riverside. A couple things I want to brag about as well, about faculty accomplishments. We've done remarkable things recently. So Susan Wessler from genetics just joined the Royal Society of the United Kingdom. So we're talking Albert Einstein, Isaac Newton. This is an enormous accomplishment. A couple others, so applause. The most recent. My colleague in philosophy, John Fisher, some of you may know, was recently named university professor. Now, they may not mean a big deal. We're all university professors, those of us who are professors here at the university. But it's actually a distinctive rank. There's about 40 in the entire University of California system. So we're talking about thousands and thousands of professors across 10 campuses. That title is beyond distinguished. It's an amazing accomplishment. That's my colleague in philosophy. Walter Clark in music was recently knighted by the King of Spain. That's quite an accomplishment. And our very own Emily Rapp Black just received a Guggenheim, so congratulations. So the symposium is an opportunity to continue the campaign, to be a part of it, to share that with the greater community. And you see a number of the themes of symposia that we've already had. This will be the last one of the year. And next year, we'll start up a whole new series and continue them throughout the campaign throughout 2020. Let me give you a little preview, little organizational details of what we're going to do tonight. We're going to start with a couple readings from a couple of our participants. And then we'll have a symposium, so that's here up on the stage. We'll have a panel discussion. I will moderate it. But if I know anything, I know these four people can carry on an interesting conversation all on their own for 48 hours nonstop in a 24-hour period. So my job will to make sure we get to go home tonight, but we're sure to have a wonderful time. That'll be the symposium. We'll have a Q&A period, so we'll get to participate, and then we'll have a nice reception here and outside afterwards. So that's the structure. So I'd like to start with the readings. The first reading will be from my neighbor, distinguished professor Susan Straight from the Department of Creative Writing.
We are neighbors, and I do want to say thank you for bringing those things up because I'm always asked, this is my 30th year at UCR, and I'm always asked about other campuses. And I always say that I would never, ever want to teach anywhere but at UCR because there's no students like ours. And it always makes me happy to be the only blonde person within a mile radius when I'm walking around my campus. And I couldn't be more proud of my former students. Today I had an email about the passing of a colleague's father, Michael Jaime Becerra, one of my favorite writers, an amazing American writer, and he had been an undergraduate student of mine before he went to Irvine, and now he's a professor here. And that kind of thing for somebody who stayed home like I did, it makes me very happy. I'm going to read a really short thing to you today, and it is from an older book, but I brought it for a reason. I'm going to read you a very small passage that I wrote when I was 19 years old, because I wrote it down the street at the gas station, right there, at that mobile station, when I was 19 years old and had gone away from here to my first year of college, but I had come back and worked at this gas station, and I decided I wanted to be a fiction writer because I'd read a story about a group of women that were deported from a linen plant in High Grove, just over the orange groves here, and what I couldn't get out of my mind, because my father worked at that linen plant, was where their children had gone. And so I want to read you this little short passage that I wrote because I was imagining a foster sister of my own. I grew up with foster kids my whole life. And somehow that was conflated in my mind, the sadness of my foster sister when I was 12 and she was 11 on University Avenue, with this notion of these women leaving their children behind. So this is a young girl. She's 3 years old. Her name is Elvia. And her mother has just been driven away in a police car and has been sent back across the border. And Elvia is waking up in the car where her mother had left her to sleep while she went around the corner. Moths dove in and out of the streetlight beam, banging against the window near Elvia, and then blurring away. Branches and leaves covered the windshield. They were pressed tight like a blanket of black knives, but Elvia wasn't to touch knives. Her mother used knives to take the spines off the green cactus pads, and they could eat the cactus then. But her father had gotten angry when he saw them eating cactus. Once Elvia had gotten the spines embedded in her finger, and her mother had pulled out the tiny red needles with her teeth. Where was her mother? The crickets resumed their shrill scraping in the black leaves all around the car. She'd awakened in the front seat. Her mother was gone. The keys were gone. Ndeche na'e. Where was her mother? I'm sorry, I forgot to say that Elvia doesn't even speak Spanish. She speaks Mixtec. It's a language from the state of Oaxaca. Ndeche na'e. Where was her mother? Ndeche Barbie. Where was her Barbie? That was what the kids next door said to her all the time through the silver fence. Captain Crunch, Barbie, Dandelion, stupid, Beaner, Mexican, hey, crickets, shut up, ice cream truck, bye. Her father had brought her the Barbie, but he was gone now. Her mother had driven up and down the driveway to practice, and then they were here at the church. Where was her mother? The silver knob had turned fire red. Her mother had taken it away. The moths bumped harder against the glass, and Elvia peered out the window. She saw the parking lot, empty and gray, as if she were inside a cloud. Viko nu'u, her mother always said, and pointed up at the clouds. But where was her mother? She was afraid, and she ducked down into the cave under the dashboard. The well of space was warm, just the right size when she drew her legs to her chest. The floor felt like evening sidewalk. She twisted her braid into a pillow for her head, and she could smell her mother's cinnamon. And then something pale bumped the other window, harder and harder, and she looked up. The sky was light, the moths were gone, and a pair of white hands pressed like a snail's underside on the glass, around a wide face as bright as the moon. She screamed and screamed while a man opened the door, pulled her out, and carried her away. At the first house, the mother was big. All Elvia could see was the hem of her flowing shift. It took up the whole front room where the children stayed. Elvia watched the edge of material sweep past her on the floor. It collected carpet strands, lint, crumbs, bits of paper. The dusty furred hem of the dress looked like the bottom of her mother's broom after she swept the kitchen. Elvia used to sit on the floor, her face close to the sweet-smelling straw as it traveled near her. She would look up at her mother, who would pretend she didn't see Elvia's feet, gliding the tickly points of straw just past the bare soles. Elvia waited for her mother. She didn't move from the floor. She didn't speak. The woman talked all the time, and another boy came. He had a bruise as red as a pomegranate on his cheek and a thick white sock on his wrist, but it wasn't a sock. When the big woman went to the kitchen, he hit Elvia across the back with the sock. It was hard like a stone around his bones, but she didn't move. She said nothing at the next house. The mother had tongue-colored hair. All the children pinched one another over every Cheerio and fought about every hot dog. She never answered at the house where the father had a silver stripe in his hair like a skunk. He kept saying to her, habla español, but all she did was cry. Elvia was silent at the house where the woman washed everyone's hair in the bathtub. Elvia's long black hair swirled around the other's legs like wet roots. She said nothing when the woman cut off her braid the next day. The black braid lay like a glistening snake in the white bottom of the kitchen sink. The woman threw Elvia's braid in the trash. She remembered her fingers wrapped around her mother's braid. Her mother had carried her on her hip. She remembered the smell of cinnamon and corn. She touched her bare neck. She was quiet, waiting for her mother to come back.
That was from High Wire Moon. What year was that? 2001. Our next reading is from Emily Rapp Black, Assistant Professor, Creative Writing.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. So I'm going to read from an unpublished new book called The Wing Beats of Insects and Birds, which is really not about insects or birds. But anyway, sort of, they appear. And the premise of the book is talking about the way in which we recover from trauma, not so much by what we decide to do inside of ourselves, but how we look to the world and relationality with the world in a different way. So no emotional bootstrapping, in other words, simplistically. So in chapter 4, called A Half-Finished Heaven, what you need to know is that the narrator, me, in this piece, has just lost her son to a disease called Tay-Sachs, which is a rare genetic disorder, and has a young child who does not have Tay-Sachs and is normative. And it's about grieving and loving at the same time, sort of living overlapping lives. So it starts with an epigraph, I need my glasses, from Thomas Transtromer called A Half-Finished Heaven. Here or elsewhere, everything starts to look around. We go out in the sun by hundreds. Every person is a half-opened door, leading to a room for everyone. At the butterfly exhibit inside a humid room of domed glass, diaphanous butterflies crossed one another in patterns of flight, so precise they seemed choreographed. These were no ordinary butterflies. Although they looked delicate, their impressive wingspans meant they flew with the strength and muscle of hummingbirds. At times, their movements were practically audible, velvet ribbons snapping the air. In the next, their loops and dives felt both lazy and deliberate. As my 2-year-old daughter Charlotte stopped to investigate a flower, a red gold wing of hair falling over her eyes, a butterfly landed on the top of her head. With obvious delight and wonder, she registered the sudden trembling weight. A fat, opulent monarch with wings so saturated in color, it was as if they were wet with fresh paint. Charlotte's chubby knees quivered slightly with the effort to remain still. The butterfly settled itself, opening and closing its black and gold wings before flying away, all without disturbing a single strand of Charlotte's fine hair. She straightened up to watch its flight and then looked over her shoulder, to be sure I was there, or maybe to see if I'd seen what she'd seen. I saw, I said. I see you. And then, because I was suddenly struck with worry, like a sharp pain between the eyes, I added, it's okay, which was more for me than for her. Charlotte rejoined the rush-stall staccato movement of the other toddlers and school-aged children running along the paved and winding path that was lined with pink and orange flowers, swaying slightly in the climate-controlled air. As she stopped to check out a dazzling yellow butterfly on the edge of a little girl's ear, another monarch, maybe the same one, landed in her palm, a sleek comma of a body. The high desert light filtered through the wings, brightening them until they appeared almost weightless, as if they might suddenly dissolve, as if disappearing into the world might be a way of anchoring to it, precisely and completely. "Ooh," Charlotte said. The butterfly's antenna vibrated like plucked harp strings, as if communicating a single note of some secret song. Charlotte remained still, the butterfly in her open palm. Although she would have been strong enough to crush this fluttering creature in her little fist, she did not. The butterfly and my daughter appeared to watch each other before it lifted off, and Charlotte raised her flushed face, squinting in the light, following the butterfly's airborne route until it disappeared behind a tree. What a day, I thought. What a girl. I rubbed my sweating palms on my jeans and felt ruthlessly happy. But in that same moment, I remembered another woman, another mother, who stood at the edge of a high bridge in another desert, this one in New Mexico, and pressed her chest against the rail, dizzy with the desire to jump, the land spread out hot and dusty on all sides, the cavernous hole. I leaned over, calling me, "Jump, just do it, now is your chance." I remembered my other child, my dead child, my Ronin, without whom I never would have become pregnant or given birth to Charlotte, whom I loved as fiercely in life as I loved her brother in death. The boy and the girl shared only one characteristic, long blonde eyelashes, which meant that the daughter only reminded me of the sun when she slept. When Charlotte fell asleep in my arms, her head resting in the angle of my bent arm, I saw Ronin in her face, the soft cheeks, the gentle countenance, those transparent eyelashes long enough to cast their own spidery shadows. In those moments, I felt as if I held both children at once. The living girl and the missing boy, siblings only in imagination, alive together only in the grief house of memory, a structure impermeable as brick and as insubstantial as a paper wall. I'd read somewhere that once you've carried a child inside you, his or her DNA stays in your body forever, a few free-floating cells that remain until they die with you. If this is true, then Ronan and Charlotte would only ever coexist in their most primitive form, as cells dividing inside the darkness of my body, or as ropes of mysterious helix crossing in the chaos of my blood, the blood that carried Tay-Sachs, the disease that killed my boy. Oh, the chemical mysteries and inevitabilities of DNA, nucleotides built block by block like the rows in a child's tower, a cord strung with the molecular power to set the course of a life or to end it. Tay-Sachs, that lethal guide that led his body to ruin over 2.5 terrible years. I don't believe in curses, but if there is such a thing as an ancient hex that moves in our modern times and kills with cruel, merciless strokes, then Tay-Sachs fits the bill. An illness from a fairy tale gone wrong. And now Ronan was gone, and Charlotte was here, spiriting through this lit space like the sprite in a kid's favorite storybook, sure-footed and strong and able, breathless with glee. Although I thought about Ronan every day in my life as a mother to an active toddler, in truth it was sometimes difficult to imagine him fully, or to conjure up the silence and stillness of his body when my daughter was so busy, so active, so able. She walked along balance beams with little help, spoke in full sentences, knew me and called me mommy, brought her hands to her mouth, ate on her own, swallowed with ease, wasn't blind or paralyzed or cognitively disappearing. She was thriving. She's so verbal, her teacher tells me. She's so good with her body, so strong, so smart. When Ronan was alive and slept next to me, immobile save for seizures or moans that might indicate pain that nobody could decipher, I traced his spine, sometimes for hours at a time, working to memorize a sensation now lost to me. Perhaps these moments in the butterfly room might someday be lost to me as well, like the words of a Bible verse that my father's friend Otto had carved into part of an aspen tree, and that still sat, faded and wordless now, on my dad's basement desk where he used to write sermons before he retired. Maybe we only live well when we understand that our lives are always spinning inside chaos, with possibilities both wondrous and catastrophic moving side by side within even the tiniest revolution. Up and away, the butterflies scattered, their bodies lit as if from within, chasing the toddlers gleefully, careening through space, landing and lifting, as if imparting some blessing on the head of each child. The scene was so rarefied and remarkable, such a blend of the majestic and the mysterious, that it didn't fit with the ordinary sticky stuff of memories and musings, these daily events that we either keep and cherish and retell, and through that change them, and the ones we cast off, often without thought or deliberation. If one believed in such things as an afterlife, this was it. That's it. Thank you. Ooh, this is mine.
Well, thanks so much to both of you. That was beautiful. We're now going to change gears. So we're going to move to the symposium and panel discussion. So the four of you get the stage. And then Reza Aslan is going to take over, and I will moderate once the discussion starts.
All right, I guess that's me. Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this Living the Promise Symposium. Obviously, this is From Genomics to Harvest. No, just kidding. No, we don't. No.
Wait.
We're the blank one. No, we're, of course, New Voices and Visions. Every one of us here represents some part of the larger creative writing work that we do here at UC Riverside. I'm going to very quickly just go through and introduce the panelists here. Of course, you have their bios already, but I do want to say a few things about them. Unfortunately, I have to use my phone because my iPad stopped working. But let me begin by just introducing myself. My name is Reza Aslan. I have been a professor here at the Creative Writing Department at UC Riverside since 2007, I believe. I teach primarily nonfiction here, both grad and undergrads. And you know, for me, what makes this place so special is precisely the interdisciplinary nature of it. I used to teach in a different department, and I think, you know, for me, I essentially quit teaching altogether and then was lured back into teaching here precisely because of the environment that we have here that fosters not just academic work, but what I like to call, you know, sort of being a scholar in the world. To my right here, of course, is Todd Goldberg. Todd Goldberg is a publishing machine. I think he writes a book a year or something like that. It's true. He's got like,
every other one's pretty good.
Yeah, 12 books, 2 collection of short stories. Has won numerous awards. My favorite book, Gangsterland, of his, I think won the Emmett Award. Is that correct? The Hammett Award. The Hammett Award for crime fiction. Of course, a lot of his writing is in noir and crime and thriller, and he's also written for television for Burn Notice, which was on for 30 years, I think. Yeah, it was on for 27 years. That show was on TV. It still is on TV somewhere in the world. Burn TV, yeah, I mean, Burn Notice is on. But Todd, especially, I just want to focus very quickly on the fact that he teaches primarily in our low residency program. And some of you may not be familiar with that, but I do think it's important to stop for a moment and talk about this program that we have in Palm Desert, which has had 300 graduates, I think, in the, how many years have we been doing it?
Since 2008.
I mean, that's remarkable. We have something like 70 or 75 current students right now. Lots of publications coming out of there. I believe something like 3/4 of the graduates have either published or sold a work within 2 years of graduating. Incredible faculty. Jill Alexander, David Yulin from the LA Times teaches there. And hopefully in the question and answer session, we'll talk a little bit about what that low residency is like. But this is Todd Goldberg, and he's a friend of mine, and I'm really glad that we're here together. And then next to Todd is Susan Straight. You already heard that Susan has been a part of this department for 3 decades. You know, we just see her. She's in many ways, no, she really is kind of in many ways like the unofficial founder of the creative writing department. I mean, in no joke, the creative writing department is what it is today. In no small part thanks to Susan and her leadership and the time and the effort that she has put into making this one of the top creative writing programs in the state. You got a chance to hear a little bit from Susan's work. She's the author of numerous books, 8 novels, including High Wire Moon, my favorite of her books. That was a finalist for the National Book Award. And also Million Nightingales, Between Heaven and Here, which was just recently published by McSweeney's in 2012, and it was named the best book of the year by the Los Angeles Times and the Daily Beast. She's also a prolific columnist. She's written personal essays, op-eds, everywhere, from New York Times Magazine to the Los Angeles Times, Believer, Nation. She's also written a large number of short stories that have appeared in Zoetrope, in Black Clock, in Plowshares. As I say, she is one of the stars of our department. So that's Susan Straight. I'm glad to be here with you. And then our newest star, Emily Rapp Black. I have to tell you, like, how excited we were to get Emily as part of our faculty, because it kind of came as a surprise, right? It was like this thing where all of a sudden we were told, "Hey, do you guys want Emily Rapp Black?" And we're like, "Yes, please." Emily, of course, she writes, primarily nonfiction and journalism. She's known for writing primarily on matters of sort of ethics and disability and medical issues, but the truth is that she writes about everything, and I mean everything, like honestly, like design. She writes about fashion. She writes about fitness. Whatever. Like it's amazing the depth and the breadth of her writing. She's the author of Poster Child, which is a memoir that came out, when did that come out? Like, right, 08, 07, something like that. And The Still Point of the Turning World, which was not just a New York Times bestseller, but it was a finalist for the Penn Center Literary Award in nonfiction. Her newest book, is that what you just read a little bit about? It's called Casa Azul Cripple. Oh, no, that's another book. No, that's another book. She's got 2 books coming out. And that's, when is that? When is that coming out? 2018 sometime. You need to be a little bit more certain about your publications. I feel like that's the case. The free column, that's right. Okay. But we are so excited to have Emily as part of our program. So you've got has been around for a while. I almost said old, but that's not the residency, and then I'm like the bastard child who's here just to kind of make everybody else. And then the dude on the exactly, I'm that guy. But we're gonna have a little conversation, of course, with Peter, and then we're gonna open it up to a Q&A. But I just want to take a moment to thank you all for being here and for listening to us.
All right, let's thank them all for being here. So having all these rock stars, it's not only these 4, but the entire creative writing department. I'm so proud, again, to have them all as colleagues. So we're going to start with a conversation a little bit about creative writing and teaching. So that's a huge part, of course, and we've heard about some of Todd's successes, but there are quite a few successes as well among our undergraduates, quite a few majors, as well as the master's program, the MFA here on the main campus. So I'm going to start with Susan. So right now you're teaching a course, Love and War in Fiction. Can you tell us about that course, how it's designed and how it's going?
Is this good?
Yeah.
Does that sound good? It's nice of you to mention that, because it is always odd to say, like, what do we teach in creative writing? And my favorite thing is to say that my mom only had a green card when she was pregnant with me. So my mom and dad didn't graduate from high school. I'm first generation to go to college. And so when I stand in front of, a group of parents, especially parents like mine that are from other countries, and they're like, my child just fell in love with poetry because of you. And I'm always like, okay, first of all, I'm sorry. And secondly, why is it important for us to be able to tell a story? And I'm teaching Love and War in Fiction. I teach 4 novels about what war means, not just to the people who are in the battle, but to the women who are left behind, to the children, to the grandparents, to the landscape itself. So that's been fascinating, and that's an undergraduate class. And what happens is we talk about 4 different wars, and then lots of the students talk about their parents' experience. We have students from Vietnam, from Shanghai, we have students from Nigeria, we have students from many, many different states in Mexico, from many places in South America. We've got tons of students from Indonesia, which has conflict right now. We have students from many, many Middle Eastern countries. We have students from all over the world. But why tell a story? Why is it important to be able to tell a story? Because sometimes that's the only way you can get it out. And I just wanted to say the one thing that I have found, I'm teaching a fiction class right now. I also spoke to honors. I spoke to 120 students last week, and I asked them something that I would ask you. How many of you have written something and you've never shown it to anyone? You wrote it for yourself, to make yourself feel better and to understand something. No, seriously, how many? That's what we're doing, is the power of writing something down. I've written, I can't even tell you how many essays about things that really, about my brother's death, about lots of other things, and I've never shown them to anyone. So I think like that's the part of what we do, is why tell a story? Sometimes you're even only telling the story for yourself.
We've got writers in different genres, so a couple of fiction writers and more nonfiction writers. How does differences in genre sort of affect teaching? Are they very different kinds of courses, or does teaching one genre, do you find it useful to sort of juxtapose in your teaching? Maybe.
Well, I think when it comes to the workshop experience, a lot of it has to do with the personality of the workshop teacher. But I do think that in general, you know, our philosophy is that you're here to learn the craft of writing. And whether you are in poetry or screenwriting or fiction or nonfiction, the craft is still very much the same. The tools that you use, the elements of your style, those are all things that are going to be more or less the same regardless of genre. And I think for me, especially, you know, when I'm focusing on nonfiction, I have students who are journalists, so they're coming from a completely different background. I have some students who are very much interested in writing personal essays. I have other students who are deeply embedded in the storytelling tradition and who are writing about you know, their lives or their families' lives. And so what we always talk about is the importance of the story and the responsibility that you have to the story. And I think what is beneficial about that is because we have this incredible program. I mean, the MFA that I did was not just segregated between fiction and nonfiction. It was like divorce. Like we weren't even allowed to talk to each other. Like the fiction people met on Tuesdays.
It sounds like my department.
Yeah, exactly. The fiction people met on Tuesdays in one building. The nonfiction people, they weren't even allowed in the building. They met in a different building. Poetry met in a completely day. The poets hung out at one bar. The fiction people hung out at another bar. And that's kind of what I thought MFA programs were like. And then I come here, and everybody's integrated, and there are fiction people in my nonfiction class and poets in the screenwriting course. And I think that is one of our strengths, is precisely that interdisciplinary nature, because while you get an opportunity to focus on different genres, it's very easy to draw these connections in the pedagogy that you get in each of these different workshops, and to recognize this overarching sort of style that is the UC Riverside Creative Writing Department, you know, about the importance of telling stories that are about people and about characters, and emphasizing you know, the nature of storytelling through these various, through the craft of writing.
So to follow up with Susan, would you find it in your course now and other sort of similar courses that the same rings true about genre, and then maybe connecting it back to the theme about your particular course? So you were talking about all the different wars, and some going on right now, and the students' experiences of those kinds of wars. I find, in sort of my own experience, I might be thinking, well, there was the war I went through, or the war that I know, and then learning other people's experiences, and then learning that there's so many commonalities in experience, even though they might seem very different, in different geopolitical, different historical contexts. So sort of connecting the issue about genre in your teaching, back to the theme, and maybe connecting it also to the theme of love. That was also a part of the course that you didn't mention.
I mean, as humans, in fact, one of our graduate students just competed in Grad Slam, and she said that, you know, we are scientific beings, but our brains are wired for narrative. Peter was there and heard her speak about that. I mean, we're wired for story, aren't we? I mean, since we've been sitting around the fire, wherever we were, on the savannah, in the snow, wherever we were sitting around a fire and someone told a story, because that's the only way you can make yourself feel it. So, for example, one of the books I teach is about the Civil War. One book that I've taught over and over again is the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. It's about a girl who is a slave. She's 9 years old. She's freed. She's 9 years old. Her family is all dead. Now, what is she? She's a free agent 9-year-old during Reconstruction. Well, that has so many echoes to right now. And there have been young African-American men in the class who say, I never thought about how long it has been in America that my body has had a price on it. And that when it did not have a price on it, it was worth less. Now that sounds terrifying to you, but that's my job, is to get someone to say that out loud. And the other people in the classroom are absolutely stunned to think about the parallels between right now. The love part is that, of course, war often starts because of love. Someone loves their belief system or religion or also wants that land. So, I mean, I really love that land of Montana. We do Fool's Crow, which is you know, the Crow and Blackfeet peoples in Montana territory were fighting Union soldiers. They were called the blue-coated Caesars. After they were done in the Civil War, then they're like, hey, let's go get some Indian land. And so it's not heroic. It's more like, what? The students are like, wait, this is where they went? So we're doing a progression like that. And then if you think about what happened during the Vietnam War, I teach a novel by a Chicano writer about the Vietnam War. He's a guy who, at 16, joined the Army and was the only survivor of his battalion in Vietnam. And he was 16 years old. Now he's a criminal defense attorney, and he's come to talk to the class before. So that's what I'm saying. There is love, too. Yeah.
So a lot of the stories so far about your teaching are stories in part about real success with students. And partly from my own experience being a professor, seeing students succeed. And in writing, you're sort of working with a skill or a craft, and in a way that makes things, you know, you get to see how they're doing and give them kind of feedback that leads to quick, immediate, hopefully, improvements in many of them, and great success. So I want to bring in Todd and Emily. So this is going to feel like changing the subject. So Todd is the crime writer. How do you see this experience where you have so many different students with very different kinds of backgrounds and different kinds of interests? How does the MFA in Palm Desert sort of bring out the best in all of your students?
Well, the important thing I think to know about my students is that they're older. The average age of my students is about 39 years old. So a lot of these students are in the second, well, not the second half of their lives, but they're in the middle of their actual functional lives and have decided that they don't want to be a doctor, a lawyer, a barista.
A philosophy professor?
An actor.
You're ready?
We had a lot of actors, a lot of actors and actresses. So these are writers that are coming to the craft with a lot of life experience that is different than if you're 23 or 24 years old and getting your graduate degree. And so the role that I see of teaching the craft to these folks is a little bit different, which is that I'm always looking for people that are ready to become a professional writer tomorrow. That the day they graduate, they're going to go out there and they're going to sell their work. Now, of course, it doesn't happen for everybody immediately. The one great example I think of in how the teaching of creative writing, I think, changed the path of a student's life is actually someone I think probably many of you are at least passingly familiar with, which is your local congressman, Mark Takano. Mark Takano was an MFA student in my program. He had run for Congress already and lost in a scandal in the early 2000s. He was outed as gay. In the early 2000s, it was a huge deal, and he lost narrowly in his first battle for Congress. He He went back to school and got his master's in fine arts, and our program at the time was on the school board and was still very active. But he was writing a memoir about his parents and about his grandparents and about their time in the internment camps. And what I remember most vividly sitting with him, number one, was that I realized I was not the smartest person in the room. And I don't like to admit that in any way, shape, or form, so please don't tell my wife that I've said this to all of you. But that he was reckoning with what was going to come next for him. He knew that he had a story he wanted to tell, and he could also see the narrative that was unfolding in the country in front of him. And so when I see Mark now out there in the world and talking, and his social media presence, for instance, he is out there telling his story over and over and over again, and it's the same story he wrote in my classroom. It's the same book that he wrote in my classroom is the book he's writing for America every single day. And he came out to, so I should say briefly, our program, it's online, and then our students come out to the desert, into Palm Springs, for 10 days in December and 10 days in June. And we all live in a hotel together and learn creative writing. It's just school, school, school the entire time. There's no spa time whatsoever. None of these people have ever come out and gotten a suntan during our residencies. And of course, Professor Rapp worked for us as well for several years also. But after this last election this year, the students in the program were feeling uneasy and unsure and didn't know where they fit in the world as writers. If truth didn't have the same value it once had, what does fiction mean? What does nonfiction mean? What does poetry mean? Why do we make movies? And so I called Congressman Takano and I said, is there any way you could come back to your alma mater as just nonfiction MFA Mark Takano? And we closed the door and we let all the students talk to you about what it means to be an artist right now, what it means to tell stories in this time, and to maybe find out what they can do to feel better about the world. And Mark said, I fly back from Washington, D.C. that morning. I will be there at 11:15. And Mark came and he told his story, and he told the story of government, and he told the story of what it feels like to be a gay, second-generation Japanese man living in Riverside trying to tell a story for everybody else. And he doesn't like to be hugged, but he gave out 120 hugs to the students and the faculty. And that's, you know, Mark didn't publish a book. Mark didn't make a movie. He didn't publish anything. He just went and became a leader of the United States of America. But that's what the value of storytelling can do, you know, that it builds that empathetic bridge. And so it's a long story to tell a short answer, which is that my job is the same as anyone else's job. It is to try to get the best out of our students to make a little difference in the world.
Great, thank you. Well, let's get Emily involved and Reza back in. So a part of this is about powerful stories and teaching the craft of storytelling. And sometimes it's very personal, a personal story that needs to be told. Sometimes it's about deep values, about belief. It's about the things we care most about. Sometimes it's about those really difficult struggles that we go through. And sometimes it's about a real success story. How did you sort of come to writing? Was there, we've heard some of your stories, your personal stories already. Sort of how did you come to writing? And then what was your, I'm sort of curious as the new member of the department, you're coming to Riverside. How's that experience been?
So the first part of that question, I came to writing because I grew up with a disability and people have been asking me rude questions my entire life in elevators. So I had a spiel and I was like, wow, I have to do this like 5 times a day, sometimes more. So I think I'll be a writer because I'm already telling the story. So I think for me it was having had those kinds of traumatic body experiences as a young child. Narrative was a way of framing the chaos and metabolizing it. I also have a father who's now retired, who was a pastor, and he could really write a good sermon back in the day. Like he knew how to tell a story that would sort of unpack what was happening in the Bible text in a way that felt meaningful without being kind of didactic, I guess, or forceful. But he would pound sometimes. just to make a point. So I think I came to writing like a lot of writers. I love to read. I loved place. I grew up in a really small town in Wyoming. Grew up poor, so we were all about the books and the fire, literally. So when I talk to my husband now, grew up in Pasadena. He like lived in the pool house in high school, and I was like chopping wood. I'm like, how did this? What?
Emily told me today about being the queen of the corn husking.
Oh, I was the queen of the corn. I was the detasseling captain at my parents' farm in the middle of nowhere, Illinois. Another pretty landscape, and I was yelling at people. I made them detassel fast when I was a teenager. And in terms of the being at UCR, I have to say, I mean, I was at the Palm Desert program, and I loved those students because they're older and they do have that life experience, and they come with these stories, and they're super motivated because they've quit whatever they were doing to reimagine themselves. What I love about the undergraduates here is that they actually have good stories to tell also, and they're very young. Like, I have an undergraduate class now. All of the students are first generation. Most of them, their parents are immigrants from Central America. And they write some stuff, and I'm like, this is way better than being at some of the schools I've been to where I get 20 stories about the kegger from like the week before. And I'm like, okay, that's not interesting when you read it 20 times. But they've had to dig deep in some sense, to use a sports metaphor. They've had to dig deep to get here, and they're kind of all in. Go big, go home. But I mean, they impress me with the way that they are able to, the way that they understand the way that narrative allows you to go on in your life without overcoming it, but metabolizing it and bringing it with you in a meaningful way. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Reza, I've got a question for you. So part of your story is sort of the move from a background more focused on being an academic in the basement and doing scholarship on small details to publish in journals that maybe I will read, to a much bigger stage, a much bigger audience, writing in a very different kind of way. What was it that led you to make that transition in your writing?
Well, I never wanted to be anything else except a writer. I mean, I don't have a single memory in which I had ever had any other goal in life. And, it was because I was a reader, and I come from a culture that is steeped in storytelling, and it just felt right to me. But, we were immigrants. I came to the United States when I was 7 years old, and, it's a very classic immigrant story. And, you can't, as an immigrant, tell your parents, I'm going to be a writer. That's what I'm going to do. And my parents would say, well, that's adorable. Like, no one's stopping you from writing. You write all you want to, okay? But go be a doctor. Go be a lawyer, and then write. Nobody's going to keep you from writing. And I didn't want to be a doctor or a lawyer, and I loved school. And so I thought, well, I'll be a scholar. And I was very good at religion. It had all the things that I love. It's sort of, I always joke that like religion is the perfect discipline for someone who can't make up their minds in the humanities. It's like, well, I love art, but I also love history, and anthropology is cool, and sociology is fun. It's like, just do religion, you get to do all of it. And my thought was always that, okay, well, I'll just have two careers. I mean, that at the very least will satisfy my immigrant parents. And then I'll also write. And it was just kind of this great luck that those two worlds collided and became one. And also, I mean, the truth is that I never wanted to be the kind of academic, who sits in a library all day. I always wanted to, my thought was, I find this stuff interesting, okay? I find it interesting. And if I find it interesting, I bet other people would probably find it interesting too if I could just figure out a way to communicate it to them. And so in between my master's and my PhD, I went and got an MFA in fiction and brought that skill, that storytelling skill to my research and in my work, and it's allowed me to flourish. But I also, going back to something like Todd was saying, is that storytelling isn't just about writing words on a page. It's about how you present yourself. Politics is an act of storytelling. Religion is just storytelling. Your very identity is a story that you created about yourself. Most of it fiction. And so for me, it was very important to not be a slave to any particular platform. And so, I write for movies and for television, but I also wanted to express storytelling in a different way, and so that's why I've begun to do things with television and The Believer, which we'll get to see in a moment. Because what I recognize in a very instinctive way, in a Jungian way, like it's in my genes, is that stories are how we understand the world. That facts and figures and data don't do anything. They don't make a real impression, even before this sort of post-fact time. But that the simplest story can transform the way a person thinks. And that's a powerful tool. It's really a weapon. And for someone like me who has as his ultimate goal the changing of minds, I'm going to use that to my advantage. I'm going to wield it whenever I can, in whatever form I can.
All right, great. Well, let's continue. Let's have a discussion now. So we'll do a Q&A. I've got the microphone, so I will pass it to the first hand. I see. Here we go.
Okay, Professor Aslan, I remember last year I read something about, I think some kind of controversy about your having taken a little bit of human parts of the religious ritual. And I think some Indians were feeling that this is a sort of stigma. Why do you want to go to be with this sect, very tiny sect of very small believers? And then why do you want to do that? Could you tell us what your take is about this?
Sure. So just to kind of catch everybody up, you're talking about when I ate a dead person's brain in India, which I didn't think was that big of a deal, but a lot of people thought was a big deal. Not kosher, yeah. So the show that I do is I go around the world and I immerse myself in religious traditions, mostly religions that are on the fringes a little bit, on the margins, religions that are misunderstood or religions that I think a lot of people already have views on, and by immersing myself into these religious traditions, my goal is to make them a little bit more familiar and a little less exotic, and most importantly, to perhaps show you that you have a lot more in common with people that you would never in a million years think that you had anything in common with. One of the episodes was about a group called the Agor. And this is a 500-year-old sect of Hinduism that rejects the founding principle of Hindu spirituality is the division between purity and pollution. That there are things that you can do or say or touch that will make you impure, that will separate you from the divine, and that will lead to a worse rebirth. And in the same way, there are ways that you can maintain your purity, which will then connect you to the divine and will lead to a better birth. The entire caste system in India is essentially predicated on this concept. The Agor believe that there's no such thing as purity and pollution, that it's all an illusion, it doesn't exist. They say that if Lord Shiva lives inside of you, then nothing can make you impure, which should sound familiar to, I think, a lot of people, right? And so the way that they prove this is by taking part in these theatrical displays of self-pollution. For instance, eating, dead people, which of course would make any average Hindu just freak out. Obviously, it's the most touching a corpse is the most impure thing that you could do. Ingesting it, is beyond the pale. And so I went and enjoyed this community. I did what they did. And then it was sort of the journey that I went on was one of discovering that there are other ways of expressing Agor beliefs without the theatrical displays. And so I go from, you know, the beach and the corpse eating to an orphanage for untouchable children, led by the same people. So it's the same philosophy, the same belief system, but expressed in a different way. That episode got a lot of, all the episodes got criticism, every episode got criticism. That episode got a lot of anger from right-wing Hindu groups because they said that it reflects poorly on Hinduism. It wasn't a show about Hinduism. It was a show about this one particular sect of Hinduism. And so a lot of that, I think, criticism just kind of missed the point. A lot of it didn't even bother really watching the episode. They just kind of saw the clips of it and immediately made certain impressions. But I think that goes to this larger point of when you're talking about religion, you're talking about identity. And so as a form of identity, these are narratives that people have constructed about themselves and their place in the world. And when you show up, you know, with a different take on that narrative, it touches people in you know, their raw nerves, and the response is often quite extreme. I mean, really quite extreme.
Well, let's get another question here.
So that's what that is about.
Hi. I can say the last decade, one of the things that UCR is very exploiting in a way is our diversity. You know, we win accolades about our student body being the most diverse in winning recognition from many accreditation entities. I attribute that, you know, besides the academic and the structure that we have of student programs, Chicano student programs, because I work with these groups and they do like 10 to 15 or 20 outreach to different, to the communities that they're looking for to bring them here. We have the first Middle Eastern center in the whole UC system. So you refer, and that probably you want to answer that about that diversity. So the question is how you know, approach that or take advantage of that in your curriculum. You know, if that a benefit that you use in you refer to that about having, you know, first generation students. So if you can expand on that, thank you.
The largest percentage of first generation college students. And then
Are you going to go?
You can go first.
Oh, I have a, yeah, I mean, I've always endeavored to make my reading lists diverse and interesting and sort of contemporary also. I mean, there's so much interesting writing coming out from people of all different backgrounds and colors and places and experiences. And so, I mean, I think that's always been part of what I do. And I think what's exciting is that when you have a diverse classroom, they read Baldwin differently. They read Virginia Woolf differently. They read contemporary writers differently. They read crime fiction differently. I mean, it's like a completely different experience than some schools where a lot of the student body are funneled from the same prep schools into the other schools, and then they land in the same classes and the same fraternities, right? So, or sororities. So I think that's one of the real gifts. And I mean, I've only had a problem with having a kind of very diverse and sort of representative syllabus in terms of reading with a classroom that's not diverse. And usually they're like, where are the old, like, dead white people? And I'm like, they're not on this list. You can check those out of the library or get it on Penguin Classics, you know. So I think that's the only time I've ever had any pushback, because I've found that the more diverse the classroom, the more hungry they are for even more diverse stories. You know, they don't just want to tell their story, because they understand, being someone who's already an outsider, that they need to seek other outsider tales also, and then that's important for the conversation, yeah.
And I think the question about the role diversity plays in the arts specifically is, you know, the arts are actually, of all the industries, they're the most aware, I think, because people aren't afraid to stand up and talk because there's not a lot of money involved. But, you know, with the students that I have, what we try to do, particularly at every single residency that we have, when all the students are together, is address sort of the hot button topics that are going on in the world. So for instance, you know, when it was becoming more and more apparent that women, and particularly minority women in Hollywood, were being marginalized, it was more difficult for them to get shows on television or movies made, or even to get into the room for a meeting. You know, what I would do is I would bring out women of color, women of different sexuality also, to come out and talk to the students about what the reality is. You know, not talk about things in the Pollyanna view of how, you know, how it could be if things were changed. I want the students to know what it's actually like and what it takes to succeed when you're that person. So if you're an African-American lesbian trying to get a television show on ABC, what is it like in that room? And so I'll bring in a writer like that to sit in a room and say to the writers, this is what it's like, this is what they will say to you. This is how you have to respond. If you want to have agency in this particular business, it's not about the things that you can perceive, it's the things that are going on in the rooms you'll never walk into in that building. And so I try to build that into the curriculum of everything that we do, that the reality of the situation goes far beyond the words you're ever going to write. That if your name is Reza Aslan, if he hadn't been on TV before, he might never have been on TV. You know, particularly now, the deck is stacked against someone like that. And so I think, you know, if we can't be honest as educators to these students who need that information, no one will be honest. So I think it's our job. I think it has to be part of the philosophy of every class we teach, to do the right thing.
All right, thank you. We'll take one more question, or
seven.
Maybe a few. I'm trying to be mindful of the time, but as long as it's interesting, we'll keep going. So far we're on a roll. We're on a roll.
So you mentioned earlier interdisciplinarity in the context of talking about creative writing. And Emily, I thought one of the things you might talk about is the way in which the creative writing program is having a real impact at the medical school. And in particular, the kind of work you and other of your colleagues are doing in advancing medical narratives and how important that's becoming to the training of future physicians. Can you say a little bit more about why you were called to that and your experience with that and the way in which you feel that the future of the practice of medicine somehow is enhanced by our ability to bring the discipline of creative writing into that field?
Thanks, Millie. Yes, so medical narratives is basically memoirs or nonfiction written by people who have bodies. I mean, we like to say it's doctors who write memoirs or it's patients who write memoirs, but really we all are mortal, right? So in some ways it's a misnomer. But it has had a kind of rise in the last decade, especially with some really big best-selling books about that. I'm certainly drawn to that work because I live with a disability. I had a son who had a fatal terminal illness, so I was very involved in pediatric hospice care, which, believe me, no one likes to talk about, and palliative care and end-of-life issues, those kinds of things. So for better or worse, I keep getting drawn back into hospitals and medical settings. I keep trying to break away, but not really. I feel comfortable there. And so what's really exciting now is that doctors who are entering sort of BA/MD programs, or what's going on here at the School of Medicine, are reading narratives by doctors and patients, different kinds of narratives from inside and outside the experience. And I collaborated on a book, When Breath Becomes Air, when the author died, and his wife and I finished the book together. And that book is, for me, that's sort of the seminal text now in what a medical narrative can do, because here was a guy who was a doctor, he was a neurosurgeon, who apparently they're not known for their bedside demeanor, but this was the guy you'd want across from you if your child had been in an accident and was brain dead. And this was the guy. I mean, that he died at 37 is wildly unfair, but that he left this beautiful document of his experience and what he learned about being a human being in the process of dying, that's kind of what a medical narrative should do, but that's kind of what writing is, because we're all headed there. So I think it's a nice way of kind of encapsulating what a medical narrative can do. So I think that's really important, because it's you know, who knows what's going to happen with healthcare, but people are going to have to start telling some pretty powerful stories a lot louder than they have been, and doctors are going to have to understand how to unpack particular things for patients. And what I love with talking to doctors who are also writing about their experiences is that you don't become a doctor without being a really hard worker, turns out. Not that writers aren't hard workers, but I don't think getting an MFA is quite like going to medical school, at least my experience, which was, you know, a lot of chats over margaritas, you know. So they're really hard workers, and they understand the stakes. So I guess a medical narrative also could be described as something where the stakes are particularly high for whomever is the author or the subject of the book. But yeah, it's an exciting field.
There are hands here.
So I go back to the 70s, and I remember a fellow named Harry Lawton, who was, I think Susan might know. And also, I'm something of a fact checker. So Professor Goldberg, Mark Takano is quite a hugger. And his,
maybe he just doesn't want to touch me.
And his scandal, his electoral scandal, was in the early mid-90s. I was losing Congress. I was the losing candidate in the early 2000s. So I read recently 107 billion people have lived on the planet. And I've read Gilgamesh, and I've read the Odyssey, and I think they're just as compelling as Cormac McCarthy. So we've had all this technology that has taken place, but it seems that the human story is still a human story, wherever it is in time. Comment?
Oh,
you know what? I mean, I think that's actually a perfect triangulation between what Dean Pena was asking and what Emily said, because something I wanted to say to you as a group is that when we're up here talking about teaching writing or teaching narrative or teaching the craft, like how do you tell the story, every single student needs to be able to tell a narrative story. This is something I just said to the honors group of 120 students last week, but also I teach a really big class with 300 students called the Mixed Race Novel in the American Experience. And this is a class I wrote so that creative writing could have a really large, you know, general education elective. And so very few of the students in there are writing majors. And this is how I begin with them. Because yes, they're like my mother. My mom didn't want me to be a writer. She wanted me to be a sports writer so she could meet Vin Scully so that she could tell him she loved him. Like that's what was going to happen. Already married, both of them. So anyway, I was a sports writer. I did meet Vin Scully, and then my task was done, and I could write fiction. So what I tell this large group, which is very much what in the tradition of Harry Lawton and his writing, everyone has to tell a narrative. In fact, the medical narrative is really important. The bedside, not just the bedside manner, but while you're writing your report, like late at night, and you're thinking about this patient with end-stage disease, you're really thinking about the story of how the patient got the disease, how you're going to talk to the family. And then I always ask, how many students are pre-law? And I'm like, okay, if you can't tell a good narrative story as a lawyer, you're going to last 3 trials. And then you're like, you're out of there. The story of why your client is innocent or why this other person is guilty is an actual narrative, isn't it? With secondary characters, who would be the police, you know, witnesses. Those are characters in the narrative that you're trying to tell. And then I turn to the people who are like this. And that's always the engineers and the business guys, all right? And then I love that. I'm like, oh my God, you guys have to tell the narrative of why your new app should be bought. And they're like, oh crap, you're totally right. How are you going to explain your new app? How are you going to explain your business model? And for the scientists, you have to think about the narrative of how you will get grant money. How are you going to present your research? to the National Science Foundation in written terms, because you don't get to go there and show them your stuff. You have to write the narrative of why you deserve funding. Everything is about is a story, whether it's, you're right, whether it's the Bible, those are stories that still capture people, whether it's Siddhartha, whether it's all of those things. To right now, everyone's obsessed with, you know, always with Breaking Bad. They're always saying, have you seen Breaking Bad? And I'm like, I can see Breaking Bad outside the front window, and then I close the curtains, all right? I do not need to see Breaking Bad on TV. I see Breaking Bad in my front yard, and then that's why I come to work. But that's why is everyone obsessed with Breaking Bad? Because that is a narrative they do not have in front of them. I prefer to watch Gilmore Girls,
I disagree.
personally.
I think people watch Breaking Bad because they wish they could be the bad guy.
Yeah.
I mean, I think people look at
You're right.
society and what great narrative does.
I think you're right.
Is it reflects back the world, and what person in their dead-end job, not saying being a chemistry teacher is a dead-end job, but what person at their job doesn't wish that they were the bad guy, that they were the Don, that they could go out there and... Too much tea.
It's my turn to be the bad guy. So we'll do one more question, and we'll let a student have the last question. Then we'll see the clip, the 5-minute clip, and then we'll have plenty of time in the reception to follow up with all of our panelists.
Thank you. So my question is for Dr. Aslan. And so what initiated your interest in becoming a religious scholar, and how did your culture, your Iranian culture in particular, influence your decision?
So I grew up during the Iranian Revolution, and so I had the opportunity to witness, even at a young age, the power that religion has to transform a society for good and for bad. And I think that it was an experience that really seared itself in my consciousness. I did not grow up in a religious family at all, and certainly not after we came to the United States. I think the last time I spoke here, I told people that I spent like most of the 80s pretending to be Mexican. True story, true story. Not that it helped or anything, because it didn't, but still. But for me, during that time, I came here and I was sort of immediately told that I was the enemy, that I was, the thing that Americans were using to identify themselves against. And it was because of my culture and my heritage and my religion, things that I didn't have any control over. And that was really fascinating for me. It made me profoundly interested in storytelling, in the stories that we tell about ourselves and how we define ourselves based on those stories. But also it made me very interested in the way that religion can be such a powerful influence in that story. That religion is ultimately not a set of things that you believe or a set of things that you do, that it's a form of identity. It's how you define yourself. And then, I was kind of also a weirdly spiritual kid. Yeah, I always, had a real spiritual longing that I never got an opportunity to really express, in my family, and in the community that I lived in. Except for my Catholic, Mexican heritage. Orale! No? Okay, sorry. Yeah, whatever. The point being that, for many, many years, that interest didn't really have an opportunity to express itself in any way. I also should say that, I was a prolific reader, and I was always interested in these characters in history who were defined as public intellectuals. And I always thought to myself, that's a thing? Like a guy who thinks out loud and gets paid for it? That's a thing? People do that? And so in the back of my mind, I thought, like, that's kind of what I want to do. Like, that's what I want. I'm going to be a writer, and then I want, like, people to pay to hear me think. And weirdly, it happened. I don't know, like, how that happened. It just kind of came. It came. It was on your dream board. It was on my dream board, and it became a thing.
Is that on your LinkedIn?
It's in my LinkedIn, public intellectual. Yeah. But in the end, honestly, it's. I'm fascinated by the way that we define ourselves, our individual identities, our collective identities. the way that we define ourselves in terms of nationality and ethnicity. And to me, the overarching way that we think about who we are is through our belief systems. And that can be religion, it can be atheism, which is a belief system. It could be race. Those are things that, as a storyteller, are just this kind of font of material that you can use, and that's why I've always been interested in it.
Let's thank them all one more time.